Picture this. It's the blistering summer of 1847, and you're sitting on a horse for 14 hours a day, every single day, for months on end. Now imagine that saddle beneath you isn't some modern marvel of engineering. It's raw, poorly treated cowhide that absorbs every drop of sweat, every bit of moisture from river crossings, every ounce of humidity hanging in the Texas air like a wet blanket. Within weeks, that leather becomes a breeding ground for bacteria that would make a Civil War field hospital look sterile by comparison. This is the world Jake Morrison knew intimately. Morrison wasn't just any cowboy. He was a former Union quartermaster who understood logistics, who could spot a systemic problem from a mile away. And in 1847, he was watching good men die from something that should have been preventable. Samuel Hayes collapsed on a Tuesday. Morrison had been expecting it for days, watching his partner wince every time he mounted up, seeing the telltale signs of infection creeping up Hayes's back like red fingers of death. The raw, festering sores that wet saddles carved into riders' backs weren't just painful, they were lethal. In an age before antibiotics, before proper understanding of infection, a saddle sore could kill you as surely as a bullet. Morrison had lost 3 good cowboys that year already, 3 men who knew cattle, who could ride anything with 4 legs, who understood the frontier better than most people understood their own backyards. But leather had defeated them all. Think about that for a moment. These weren't men who backed down from stampedes or Indians or rattlesnakes. They were brought low by their own equipment. Now, Morrison's systematic mind, that quartermaster's brain that had kept Union soldiers supplied during some of the most chaotic campaigns of the war, kept turning this problem over and over. He'd tried everything the frontier offered, oiling the leather, which only made it retain more moisture, different tanning methods, which cost a fortune and barely helped, various folk remedies involving bear grease and pine tar that mostly just made the saddles smell worse while providing no real protection. The answer came from the sky. As thunder rolled across the Brazos River Valley that fateful week, Morrison found himself caught in one of those Texas storms that makes Noah's flood look like a spring shower. We're talking about rain that falls not in drops but in sheets, the kind of deluge that turns creeks into rivers and rivers into inland seas. Morrison, leading a small herd back from market, had maybe 20 minutes to find shelter before the storm hit with the fury of an angry god. He spotted the cave opening just as the first real waves of rain began to fall. It wasn't much a shallow depression in the limestone bluffs that lined the Brazos, but it was dry, and when you're caught in a Texas thunderstorm, dry is paradise. But Morrison wasn't alone. Sitting cross-legged near the back of the cave, working by the light of a small fire, was an aging Comanche craftsman. Morrison's hand instinctively moved toward his pistol. This was 1847. Remember, when the relationship between white settlers and Native Americans was still defined more by violence than understanding. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the man's age. Maybe it was the careful, deliberate way he worked on what appeared to be a piece of hide, or maybe it was simply the universal recognition that 2 people caught in the same storm had bigger problems than their cultural differences. The man looked up and nodded. He said something in Comanche that Morrison didn't understand, but the gesture toward the fire was universal. Come, sit, warm yourself. The storm might last a while. And last it did. For 7 long days, rain fell with biblical intensity. The Brazos rose 15 feet above its normal level. Cattle scattered to high ground. And in that cave, 2 men from different worlds found themselves sharing more than shelter. The Comanche's name, Morrison eventually learned through a mixture of sign language, broken Spanish, and sheer persistence, was White Elk. He was old, maybe 70, maybe 80, and his hands moved with the confidence of someone who had been working leather since childhood. But this wasn't just any leather work. Morrison watched, fascinated, as White Elk applied some kind of mixture to a piece of buffalo hide that transformed it before his eyes. You have to understand, Morrison had been around leather his entire adult life. Military saddles, civilian saddles, harnesses, boots. He knew how hide behaved, how it absorbed water, how it cracked and split and eventually failed. But whatever White Elk was doing, it was creating something Morrison had never seen before. The mixture White Elk used seemed simple enough: rendered buffalo fat, wild beeswax, and something that looked like crushed sage. But the proportions, the technique, the way he worked, the mixture into the hide with heated stones, this was knowledge passed down through generations, refined through countless harsh winters and scorching summers on the Great Plains. Morrison's quartermaster mind immediately grasped the implications. This wasn't just about making leather waterproof, though that alone would have been revolutionary. This was about creating a material that could withstand the daily punishment of frontier life, without breaking down, without becoming a breeding ground for the infections that were killing his men. Through that week of shared firelight and translated stories, White Elk revealed how his people had perfected this technique over centuries. The buffalo fat provided deep conditioning that prevented cracking. The beeswax created a barrier against moisture while still allowing the leather to breathe. The sage, Morrison would later learn, had natural antimicrobial properties that helped prevent the bacterial growth that turned saddle sores into death sentences. But White Elk shared something else, a philosophy that would shape everything Morrison did afterward. Knowledge, the old Comanche explained through careful gestures and halting Spanish, was like fire. Hoarded, it dies. Shared, it spreads and gives life to many. Morrison spent every hour of that storm experimenting. He had scraps of his own deteriorating saddle, and White Elk patiently showed him how to prepare the mixture, how to work it into the leather, how to test the results. Morrison documented everything in the small leather journal. He always carried measurements, techniques, observations about how the treated leather behaved differently than the untreated material. By the time the storm broke and the sun emerged to illuminate a transformed landscape, Morrison had more than just dry ground to stand on. He had the beginning of a revolution, but he had no idea that this knowledge would soon make him the most wanted man in Texas, not by outlaws or Indians, but by an entire industry that had built its profits on leather that was designed to fail. Now, you might think that discovering a revolutionary leather treatment would be enough to make any man rich overnight. But this was the frontier, remember, a place where skepticism wasn't just healthy, it was essential for survival. Cowboys had seen too many snake oil salesmen, too many miracle cures that turned out to be nothing more than expensive ways to die slower. So when Jake Morrison returned from that storm-blessed week with wild claims about waterproof leather, most folks figured the lightning had scrambled his brains. Most folks, but not Tom Cactus McCready. McCready had earned his nickname the hard way by surviving longer in hostile country than most men thought possible. He was a trail boss who'd driven cattle from the Rio Grande to Kansas City more times than he could count, and he had the scars to prove it. More importantly, he had the kind of practical intelligence that separated living cowboys from dead ones. And in the spring of 1851, McCready had a problem that was costing him more than money, it was costing him men. He'd already buried 2 cowboys that season. Good men, experienced riders who'd fallen victim to the same infection that had claimed Samuel Hayes and countless others. Blood poisoning from saddle sores wasn't just a hazard of the job anymore, it was becoming an epidemic that threatened the entire cattle industry. So when Morrison approached McCready with his wild story about ancient Comanche wisdom and magical leather treatments, McCready didn't laugh him out of camp. Instead, he did what any smart businessman does when faced with a potential solution to an expensive problem. He demanded proof. "Show me," Macready said, pointing to Morrison's saddle. "If this Indian medicine of yours is worth a damn, prove it." What happened next became the stuff of legend among cowboys from Texas to Montana. Morrison's saddle, the same one he'd experimented on during that week in the cave, had been in constant use for nearly 4 years. 4 years of river crossings, rainstorms, scorching heat, and the daily punishment of frontier life. By all rights, it should have been falling apart, cracked and rotted like every other piece of leather equipment from that era. Instead, it looked like it had been made yesterday. The leather was supple, flexible, with none of the cracking or hardening that marked inferior treatment. When Macready poured water on it, and he poured a lot of water, it beaded up and ran off like rain on a duck's back. When he pressed his finger into the leather, it sprang back without leaving a mark. When he smelled it, there was no trace of the sour, rotting odor that characterized most frontier saddles after a few months of use. Macready was convinced, but convincing one skeptical trail boss was nothing compared to what Morrison faced during the legendary cattle drive of 1851. Picture this scene. Nearly 3,000 head of cattle, 47 cowboys, and a trail that stretched 800 miles from the heart of Texas to the railheads of Kansas. This wasn't just any cattle drive. This was the kind of massive undertaking that could make or break a dozen ranches. The kind of operation where every piece of equipment had to perform flawlessly for months on end, and they had to cross 7 rivers. Now, river crossings were the nightmare scenarios of every trail boss. Cattle panicked, cowboys got separated, and equipment that had seemed perfectly fine on dry land fell apart the moment it got thoroughly soaked. Saddles were especially vulnerable. The repeated cycles of soaking and drying would warp the leather, crack the stitching, and turn a reliable piece of gear into a liability that could get a man killed. But Morrison's treated saddle? It laughed at those river crossings. At the Brazos, the same river where Morrison had learned white elk secrets, Macready watched in amazement as Morrison's saddle emerged from the crossing, looking exactly as it had going in. Meanwhile, 3 other cowboys had to stop and make emergency repairs to saddles that had warped so badly they couldn't sit properly. By the Red River crossing, word was spreading through the camp like wildfire. Cowboys were examining Morrison's saddle with the intensity of scientists studying a new species. They poked it, prodded it, even sniffed it, trying to understand how it could possibly perform so differently from their own gear. At the Arkansas River, the 7th and final major crossing Morrison's saddle had become the stuff of legend. While other cowboys nursed equipment that was barely holding together, Morrison looked like he'd just started the drive. His saddle was still supple, still waterproof, still comfortable enough for 14-hour days in the saddle. The formula became currency more valuable than gold. Think about that for a moment. In an economy based on cattle and land, where hard currency was scarce and credit was non-existent, Morrison's knowledge became the most sought-after commodity on the frontier. Cowboys would trade prize horses for the secret. Ranchers offered partnerships in exchange for the formula. Trail bosses promised percentages of their profits for access to the treatment. But Morrison was selective. He understood that knowledge shared carelessly loses its value, while knowledge shared strategically can change the world. He chose his disciples carefully, looking for people who wouldn't just use the formula but would understand its deeper implications. The first person he taught the complete formula to wasn't another cowboy, it was Maria Vasquez. Vasquez was already a force to be reckoned with in San Antonio. She ran a leather goods business that supplied saddles and tack to half the ranches in South Texas, and she had the kind of business sense that turned small operations into empires. More importantly, she understood that this wasn't just about making better saddles. This was about revolutionizing an entire industry. Within 2 years, Vasquez had established what amounted to a saddle treatment empire that stretched from San Antonio to Denver. She didn't just apply Morrison's formula, she refined it, adapted it, created variations for different climates and different types of leather. Her workshops became training centers, where carefully selected craftsmen learned not just the technique, but the philosophy behind it. The Abilene Saddle Challenge of 1855 became the ultimate demonstration of what Morrison's innovation could achieve. This wasn't some informal competition between cowboys. This was a formal contest organized by the Kansas Cattlemen's Association to determine once and for all which leather treatments actually worked. The rules were simple but brutal. Each saddle would be submerged in a stock tank for 8 days, then evaluated for usability. Most saddles, everyone assumed, would emerge as nothing more than putrid leather soup. The contest was really about which treatments would fail least catastrophically. Morrison's treated saddle didn't just survive, it emerged ready to ride. After 8 days underwater, while competitor saddles had literally dissolved or warped beyond recognition, Morrison's saddle looked like it had simply been given a thorough cleaning. The leather was still supple, still properly shaped, still capable of providing the comfort and support that kept cowboys alive during long drives. The crowd that gathered to witness the results included ranchers, leather workers, and businessmen from across the frontier. They watched in stunned silence as Morrison dried off his saddle, adjusted the stirrups, and swung into the saddle as if nothing had happened. Then he rode that saddle for the next 6 hours, demonstrating that it wasn't just intact, it was fully functional. But success, as Morrison was about to learn, brought dangers he hadn't anticipated. The leather industry back east had been watching the developments on the frontier with growing alarm. Saddles that lasted decades instead of months meant fewer sales, smaller profits, and the potential collapse of an economic system built on planned obsolescence. And they weren't going to let that happen without a fight. By 1858, Jake Morrison had created something he never intended a direct threat to one of the most powerful industrial cartels in America. Back east, in the mahogany-paneled boardrooms of Boston and New York, men in expensive suits were looking at declining profit margins and asking uncomfortable questions. Why were frontier saddle orders dropping? Why were replacement requests becoming less frequent? And most alarming of all, why were Western leather goods lasting so much longer than they were supposed to? The answer, they discovered, had a name. Jake Morrison. Now, you have to understand the economics of the leather industry in the 1850s. This wasn't some small cottage industry. We're talking about a business worth millions of dollars, employing thousands of workers, with connections to banks, railroads, and political machines from coast to coast. And the entire system was built on a simple premise. Leather goods were supposed to fail. Not immediately, of course. That would be too obvious. But after a year or two of use, saddles were expected to crack, warp, and become uncomfortable enough that customers would need replacements. Harnesses were supposed to weaken and require expensive repairs. Boots were designed to fall apart just when the owner had gotten comfortable with them. It was planned obsolescence before anyone had invented the term, and it was incredibly profitable. Enter Morrison's formula, which threatened to make leather goods last decades instead of months. From the perspective of Eastern manufacturers, this wasn't innovation, this was economic terrorism. The man leading the counterattack was Cornelius Ashford of the Boston Saddlery Company. Ashford was old money, Harvard-educated, and utterly ruthless when it came to protecting his business interests. He'd built his fortune on the principle that customers should buy his products repeatedly, not once in a lifetime. Morrison's breakthrough threatened to reduce his market by 90%, and Ashford wasn't the type of man to accept that kind of loss quietly. His first move was intelligence gathering. Throughout 1857, mysterious strangers began appearing at cattle drives and frontier towns, asking careful questions about saddle treatments and leather care. They posed as traveling salesmen, itinerant workers, even missionaries spreading the gospel to cowboys. But they all had the same objective: find Morrison, learn his secrets, and report back to Boston. What they discovered alarmed Ashford even more than he'd expected. Morrison wasn't just sitting on a superior leather treatment, he was actively teaching it to others. The knowledge was spreading like a virus through the frontier community, creating a network of people who no longer needed Eastern manufacturers. Ashford's response was swift and decisive. In the spring of 1858, he dispatched a team of industrial spies to infiltrate Morrison's network and steal or destroy the formula. These weren't cowboys or frontier types, these were professional operatives, men who specialized in corporate espionage and weren't particularly concerned about the legality of their methods. The conflict exploded into violence at Bentley's tannery on a hot Tuesday morning in June. Bentley's was one of Morrison's training centers, a place where carefully selected craftsmen learned not just the formula, but the philosophy behind it. It was also where Morrison kept his most detailed notes, measurements, variations, improvements he'd developed over years of experimentation. 20 armed men surrounded the tannery at dawn. They weren't wearing masks or trying to hide their intentions. Their leader, a cold-eyed man named Vincent Carver who'd been sent directly from Boston, made their demands clear. Morrison would surrender his notes and cease all training activities, or they would burn the tannery to the ground. Morrison's response revealed the strategic brilliance that had made him such an effective quartermaster during the war. Instead of fighting or surrendering, he made an offer that caught everyone off guard. "You want the formula?" Morrison said, looking directly at Carver. "Fine. I'll teach it to your sons." It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Morrison had identified the one thing these men valued more than their employers' profits, their own children's futures. He offered to teach the complete formula to the sons of every man present, making them partners in the knowledge rather than enemies of it. But not everyone was interested in compromise. The established leather cartels had too much invested in the old system to accept peaceful coexistence. When word of Morrison's offer reached Boston, Ashford's reaction was volcanic. He'd sent men to destroy a competitor, not to create new ones. What followed became known as the Saddlemakers' Rebellion, a conflict that saw midnight raids, poisoned cattle, and the murder of 2 formula holders before Texas Rangers finally intervened. The violence began in earnest when Ashford's agents tried to destroy Maria Vasquez's workshop in San Antonio. Vasquez had become one of Morrison's most successful disciples, and her operation represented everything the Eastern cartels feared: a Western manufacturer producing superior goods that lasted indefinitely. But Vasquez wasn't some helpless target. She'd survived in business on the frontier by being tougher and smarter than her competitors. And she wasn't about to let Eastern thugs destroy what she'd built. When Ashford's men arrived at her workshop, they found it defended by armed craftsmen who'd been expecting them. The gunfight that erupted in the streets of San Antonio lasted nearly 2 hours and left 3 men dead. More importantly, it demonstrated that Morrison's network wasn't just a collection of individual craftsmen. It was an organized resistance movement with the resources and determination to fight back. Morrison's inner circle adapted quickly to the new reality. They developed codes and recognition signals that allowed formula holders to identify each other safely. They created safe houses where cowboys could learn the treatment without fear of discovery. Most cleverly, they began hiding the formula ingredients in plain sight. The trail song, "The Lonesome Spotted Calf," became famous throughout the West, but few people realized that each verse contained precise measurements for Morrison's formula. Cowboys would sing it around campfires, never knowing they were preserving industrial secrets that Eastern cartels would kill to obtain. 3 parts tallow to the morning sun, 1 part wax when the day is done, sage and resin from the high pine tree. That's the mixture that will set you free. Rebecca Stone, Morrison's most trusted lieutenant, established what amounted to an underground railroad of saddle knowledge. Stone had been one of the first people Morrison taught after his return from that fateful week with White Elk, and she understood better than anyone how to protect and spread the knowledge. Her network stretched from Texas to Colorado, with safe houses where cowboys could learn the formula and training centers where craftsmen could perfect the technique. She recruited carefully, looking for people who understood that they weren't just learning a leather treatment. They were joining a revolution that would reshape the frontier economy. The Rangers' intervention came after the murder of Tom. Brennan, a formula holder who'd been found shot dead outside Abilene with his workshop burned to the ground. Brennan's death crossed a line that even the corrupt officials bought by Eastern money couldn't ignore. When Texas Rangers started investigating, they uncovered a conspiracy that reached all the way back to Boston boardrooms. But the investigation also revealed something else. Morrison had vanished. Not fled, not hidden, not gone into temporary exile. Vanished. As if he'd simply walked out of the world one day and never returned. His disappearance would become one of the great mysteries of the frontier, a puzzle that would haunt both his allies and enemies for decades to come. But before we can understand what happened to Jake Morrison, we need to understand what he'd already accomplished and the legacy he'd created that would outlast any individual man. December 18th, 62, was the kind of winter day that kills men and horses with equal indifference. A blizzard had been building across the Texas Panhandle for 3 days, driven by winds that could knock a grown man off his feet and temperatures that turned exposed skin black in minutes. It was the kind of storm that smart people waited out in warm buildings, surrounded by supplies and good company. Jake Morrison wasn't smart people, apparently. Or maybe he was responding to something the rest of us couldn't see. On that bitter morning, Morrison saddled his horse and rode out into weather that should have been a death sentence. His destination was unclear. Some said he was heading to check on cattle trapped by the storm. Others claimed he was riding to meet a contact from his underground network. What everyone agreed on was that Jake Morrison, the man who'd revolutionized frontier leather and outfought Eastern industrial cartels, simply disappeared into a wall of white and never came back. They found his horse 2 days later, standing patient and unharmed in a sheltered grove 15 miles from where Morrison had been last seen. The animal was still saddled, still carrying Morrison's gear, still wearing the legendary saddle that had started it all. But of Morrison himself, there was no trace. Some folks claimed he'd been murdered by Ashford's agents, his body hidden where it would never be found. Others insisted he'd deliberately vanished, perhaps heading to California or Mexico to start a new life away from the violence his discovery had unleashed. A few romantic souls suggested he'd returned to live with White Elk's people, disappearing into the vast emptiness of Comanche territory. The truth, as it often does, proved stranger than any of the theories. 27 years later, in 1889, a young saddle maker named Timothy Hart was repairing Morrison's legendary saddle for a museum display when he made a discovery that changed everything. Hidden inside the saddle's construction, protected by layers of Morrison's own waterproof treatment, was a prated, leather-wrapped package containing Morrison's complete journal. Not just the formula, though, that was there, recorded in Morrison's careful handwriting with measurements precise enough to recreate his treatment exactly. The journal contained something far more valuable: Morrison's philosophy, his understanding of what he'd discovered, and his vision for how that knowledge should be used. "Knowledge hoarded dies," Morrison had written in his final entry, dated December 15, 1862, just 3 days before his disappearance. "But knowledge shared lives forever. I have given this secret to the frontier, not because it will make men rich, but because it will keep them alive. Let no man claim ownership of what belongs to everyone who risks their life on leather and horse. The journal revealed that Morrison's disappearance hadn't been accidental or violent. It had been deliberate. Faced with increasing pressure from both Eastern cartels and his own followers to either commercialize or completely protect his discovery, Morrison had chosen a third option. He'd given the knowledge to the world, and then removed himself from the equation, ensuring that no one could claim exclusive rights to what he'd learned. But by 1889, Morrison's absence had hardly slowed the revolution he'd started. If anything, his mysterious disappearance had turned him into a folk hero whose influence grew stronger with each passing year. Maria Vasquez had built her saddle treatment business into a commercial empire employing over 300 workers across 4 states. Her workshops in San Antonio, Denver, Kansas City, and Chicago produced treated leather goods that were shipped as far as San Francisco and New York. More importantly, she'd trained hundreds of craftsmen in Morrison's techniques, ensuring the knowledge would survive even if her business didn't. Rebecca Stone's Underground Railroad had evolved into something approaching a formal education system. Her network of safe houses had become training centers where not just cowboys but blacksmiths, bootmakers, and harness crafters could learn variations of Morrison's formula adapted to their specific needs. By 1880, Stone's organization was training over 1,000 new craftsmen each year. The economic impact proved staggering when economists finally calculated the numbers in the early 1900s. Longer cattle drives had become possible, opening markets from Chicago to California that had previously been unreachable. Cowboys' working lives had extended by an average of 15 to 20 years, creating a more experienced and efficient workforce. Most remarkably, the reduction in infection-related deaths had saved an estimated 3,000 lives between 1850 and 1890. But perhaps the most significant legacy belonged to someone who'd learned Morrison's secrets at the age of 12 and never forgotten them. Sarah Morrison Hayes was Jake Morrison's daughter, not by blood, but by choice. Morrison had rescued her from an orphanage in Dallas in 1855, recognizing in the sharp-eyed 12-year-old the same systematic intelligence that had made him such an effective quartermaster. He'd taught her not just the formula, but the thinking behind it, the way to see problems that others missed and solutions that others overlooked. In 1890, Sarah established the Morrison Leather Treatment Company, the first business to openly commercialize Morrison's formula and use his name. But this wasn't the kind of exploitative commercialization that Morrison had fought against. Sarah understood her adoptive father's philosophy too well for that. The Morrison Company didn't just sell treated leather goods, it taught the treatment process to anyone willing to learn. Sarah published detailed instructions in newspapers and farming journals, distributed free samples to cowboys and craftsmen, and established scholarship programs that trained young people in both the technical and philosophical aspects of Morrison's work. By 1900, the Morrison Company employed over 200 workers and operated training centers in 12 states. But Sarah measured success differently than most business owners. Her real achievement was that by the turn of the century, variations of Morrison's treatment had become so widespread that no single company could claim control over them. The Eastern cartels that had tried to destroy Morrison's network found themselves forced to adapt or die. Some, like the Boston Saddlery Company, eventually adopted modified versions of Morrison's formula and survived by becoming part of the revolution they'd tried to stop. Others, unable to abandon their planned obsolescence business model, simply disappeared as customers abandoned inferior products for superior alternatives. Modern analysis of Morrison's formula reveals just how far ahead of his time he really was. What he'd discovered through frontier experimentation and ancient Comanche wisdom was essentially early polymer chemistry, the creation of a breathable yet waterproof barrier that anticipated synthetic material science by nearly a century. Today's most advanced saddle treatments still follow Morrison's basic principles. The combination of conditioning agents, moisture barriers, and antimicrobial compounds that he perfected in that storm-swept cave remains the foundation of leather preservation technology. Rodeo champions and working cowboys still swear by preparations that trace their chemical lineage directly back to buffalo fat, beeswax, sage, and pine resin mixed in precise proportions. But perhaps the most lasting legacy isn't chemical, it's philosophical. Morrison's belief that knowledge belongs to everyone who needs it, that innovation should serve survival rather than profit, and that the best way to preserve a discovery is to give it away completely, has influenced everything from open-source software development to modern medical research. In a world where patents and proprietary formulas dominate industrial development, Morrison's approach seems almost radical, yet the results speak for themselves. His treatment didn't just survive, it thrived, evolved, and continues to save lives more than a century and a half after he first learned it from an aging Comanche craftsman seeking shelter from a Texas storm. The cave where Morrison and White Elk spent that transformative week was designated a historical landmark in 1968. Visitors can still see the limestone walls where two men from different worlds shared knowledge that would change the frontier forever. A brass plaque near the entrance bears Morrison's final journal entry. Knowledge hoarded dies, but knowledge shared lives forever. Every year, hundreds of cowboys, craftsmen, and curious tourists make the pilgrimage to that unremarkable limestone depression in the Brazos River Valley. They come seeking connection to a story that represents something increasingly rare in our modern world, the idea that the most valuable discoveries are those we give away. And perhaps, on certain storm-swept nights when the wind howls across the Texas plains with the same fury it carried in 1847, visitors might catch a glimpse of two figures silhouetted against the firelight, an aging Comanche craftsman and a systematic-minded cowboy, still sharing knowledge that refuses to die, still proving that the best way to preserve a legacy is to ensure it belongs to everyone. In the end, Jake Morrison got exactly what he wanted. His knowledge didn't make him rich, didn't make him famous, didn't even allow him to live a long and comfortable life. But it did something more important. It lived forever, passed from teacher to student, generation to generation, ensuring that good people wouldn't die from problems that could be solved. And in a world where so much knowledge is hoarded, patented, and sold to the highest bidder, perhaps that's the most revolutionary legacy of all.